welcome to Sahitya Academy's web literature series, and today we are going to discuss creativity and isolation. Right now we are at the beginning of a pandemic and we are already seeing pockets of isolation, some kind of enforced isolation. They may become universal, but we do not know yet. But through the history, there is a belief that isolation fuels creativity. The world of art, music, films, literature in the Western world are littered with examples of people getting inspired by time spent by oneself. At the heart of it, this kind of a belief is the intended withdrawal from society, friends, and the family. Helps people to discover oneself and express creatively. The very famous examples are Nietzsche in the West, Sri Aurobindo in the West. Both produced remarkable works. In fact, if Picasso, he once said, almost bordering on bravado, without great solitude, no serious work is possible. But the greatest example of for those people who are who advocate for isolation and that leads to creativity is Newton. Newton, whatever the science technology we have, is all result of Newton. The Newton discovery the four important laws, including laws of motion. He did it in the period of 18 months of isolation due to a pandemic of plague, and in between 1865 and 1867. And it is the greatest discovery, the scientific work written till date. But it is not so universal as it seems. And there are examples even within India. So for example, Amritlal Nagar from north, Pudummai Pittan from south. They never went to isolation to create immortal works. There are more examples of that in Asia. But today we have two creative writers to discuss this. But why literary people? Nowhere has isolation been described with such visceral power than through literature. That is the main reason why we are going to discuss this with literary people. And to discuss this, we have very distinguished scholars, Professor Shivaprakash, multiple award winner, creative writer, poet, playwright, and translator, Professor Sumanyu Satpathy, eminent academician, writer, translator, scholar, and critic. So welcome to the show, Professor Shivaprakash and Professor Sumanyu Satpathy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Shivaprakash, we will begin with you. So do you agree that literary works always get fueled by isolation?
Yes and no. Writer, like any other artist, needs periods of isolation, sometimes self-isolation, to discover his voice. Because the voice cannot be heard when there is the medley of other voices. So one has to withdraw into silence and isolation. But at the same time, unless one has lived in the midst of other people, has gathered experience in the company of people, one doesn't get the material for creative writing. So I think it's important for a creative person to alternate between company and isolation. And but the act of producing a literary work, in my experience and the experience of many other writers, requires silence.
Okay.
Except some very hardcore Marxist writers who say that they swear by the class and movement, etc. There no serious writer, I think, is able to create something when surrounded by people.
Okay. I think Professor Sumanyu Satpathy is disconnected. Maybe you will come. Professor Sumanyu, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. I'm there.
Okay, okay. So you heard what Professor Shivaprakash said, and
Yes.
what is your take on this?
I agree with Professor Shiva Prakash. He's a renowned writer. He's a creative writer. I am not one, but you know, I have been interacting with creative writers and artists, and I have read about them, and I feel that the answer is both yes and no. Whether isolation is a precondition for creativity, it's more of a no for me than yes. See, somehow two identity markers have been created mostly as traditionally, generally, but even it was strengthened during the Romantic era, and this continued for a long time. One is that the creative writer or the creative artist has to be a dope addict, an alcoholic, like Coleridge and so on and so forth, which in a way takes him or her into a mood of isolation, enables him or her to create. For example, the famous example of Oscar Wilde is isolation, but he had a thing or two to say about being isolated. As all of us know, he was imprisoned and he created some of his masterly prose works, and one ballad, the ballad of Reading Jail, during confinement. And one of the prose pieces, which is The Soul of Man Under Socialism, he makes this statement, and I'll permit me to read it out. It's a very short quotation,
Okay.
and I quote Oscar Wilde. Now and then, a great man of science like Darwin, a great poet like Keats, a fine critical spirit like Renan, a supreme artist like Flaubert has been able to isolate himself to keep himself out of reach of the clamorous claims of others, to stand under the shelter of the wall so as to realize the perfection of what was in him. So this is Oscar Wilde, but of course he is a bit ironical here when he is pleading for socialism and saying that socialism actually promotes individualism, and which is contrary to the general notion of or theory of socialism. And he says individualism is necessary for it's a precondition for creation. So what we are looking at here is again a highly nuanced view of how isolation or solitude leads to creativity. At the same time, there have been many writers who or writers and creative artists who crave for company and a society. The way, for example, William Cowper impersonates the voice of Alexander Selkirk. This is something that the Odia writer, the poet Madhusudan Rao also translates, Nirvashitara Vilap, which is, the writer is craving for society, for friends. So without friends, without society, creativity is not possible. Maybe during the act of creation, one needs isolation. And perhaps Einstein, it was, who said that he preferred to go on a long walk on a sea beach so that he can be alone and he can think about, some new ideas, allow his ideas to grow. So there are these contradictory views, but I also feel that without society, without companionship, creativity is not possible. A
Okay.
long drawn shutdown is not going to help. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Professor Shivaprakash, but there are, of course, in the historically we have seen that isolation also leads to some kind of insanity, mental instability even among the creative writers. Without taking names, it needs a kind of, especially for somebody to be like Newton, to such a prolonged isolation, for 18 months, or for that matter, Nietzsche or Aurobindo for years. Historically we have seen that it requires entirely different frame of mind and strength and willpower to deal with isolation.
Yeah. See, when Sumanyu was talking, I was remembering he made a mention of those who wrote in confinement in prisons. Some of the greatest modern poetry was written by poets during periods of confinement. For example, Nissim Hikmet, the Turkish poet, was in jail for several decades, and he wrote magnificent poetry. And Wole Soyinka wrote some of his best poems. His book is called Shackle the Crypt. When he was in jail for a couple of years, he was not even given papers to write on. And another example that springs to my mind is the American poet Emily Dickinson. Of course, she was not put into jail. She lived alone most of the time, as if she was. She had she knew very few people. She had not traveled much. She hadn't traveled beyond the radius of some 20, 30 miles from Massachusetts. She was not married. She had no love life. Still, she wrote some of the greatest love poems. But the point is this: those who write such wonderful poetry in isolation are those who are longing for some kind of communion. People like Nissim Hikmet had their history in revolutionary movements, and they were involved with a lot of people, and that became the material for his poetry. And for Wole Soyinka, he was also part of anti-apartheid movement and black movement and democratic movements, and that became the raw material for his poetry during the days of confinement. But for Emily Dickinson, just a few chance encounters she had with other men was enough to provide her with this kind of raw material. So some people make most of very little exposure to company and experience, and some people need quite a bit of it. But there is no guarantee that isolation itself can, for a very long period, beyond a point, can lead to any creative output, or even the taking drugs, for example. For example, Coleridge stopped writing after some time. He was unable to write because when he became an addict to this intoxicant. So I think there's a dialectic relationship between experience in company and experience of isolation. And in my own personal experience, I've written some of my best works in times of isolation, self-isolation, but the raw material came from an experience in society with other people. But now, during the time of pandemic, we're going through another phase where the isolation is not voluntary. Yeah. It has become inevitable for people. How do we continue to create in this situation? And I don't know when it's going to end. I think scientists know as little as about it as astrologers. All of them are doing the intelligent and unintelligent guesswork. Nobody knows when it's going to end. So if it continues beyond a few months, a year, for example, and what does one do? I have no clue. I have no clue how I should continue, because whatever I've been writing, I have written quite a few poems during this period, but all this is taken from my experience before the pandemic started. Now, how long will I be able to work with this stock of experience? And the time they've already started feeling the need to go out to get more experience, but it's not possible.
Yeah.
So this is the dilemma that we are going through now.
Yeah, so that's a very valid point with Shivaprakash and Professor Satpathy, that again to continue with where Professor Shivaprakash left. We have not one or two, maybe around 100 psychological studies which are carried out that isolation does spark creative ideas, but isolation beyond a point, it depends on the individual. You continue beyond a point, like, one of the famous examples that psychological studies which came out is people trying to emulate Sylvia Plath or Oscar Wilde. I mean, that can be very dangerous. That is what psychological studies came to the conclusion. All of them, almost all of them. Yeah.
Yes, I was about to mention Sylvia Plath in the context of your question, the earlier question before Shivaprakash started talking about his own experience and his own views. Sylvia Plath, about the relationship that you mentioned between isolation and psychic disorder. It's not that isolation, it's only isolation which can lead to psychological disorder. But in case there is psychological disorder, a kind of therapy, medical therapy, particularly shock therapy, created lots of problems for Sylvia Plath. And the novel that she wrote, I forget the title, Bell Jar or which one, where the character is actually subjected to this kind of therapy, and she becomes neurotic. At the same time, she is a creative writer, and the intricate relationship between the mental, psychological frame of mind and isolation, forced isolation. That was a very pertinent point that was raised: forced isolation and voluntary isolation. Right now, what we are going through is a kind of forced isolation. Creative minds always prefer voluntary isolation rather than forced isolation. At the same time, memory plays a major role. I think this dimension of isolation cannot be ignored. How memory plays a very important role. I recall the experience of Ezra Pound when he was confined in the bookless air, as he calls it, bookless air of Pisa, where he was confined without anything, no companion, no books, nothing. And he wrote some of the finest cantos, which go by the name Pisan cantos, and he remembers all the books. His strong memory helps him in creating a world of emotion. Isolation. So there is an inner life that every creative writer or creative artist or creative mind leads. That inner life can never be isolated. The inner life is always in company of friends, relatives, lovers, books, and their memory stands him or her in good stead. I think this is what I can say insofar as the work of say even Dostoevsky's, the book on the underground man, the anonymous person, underground man, and that particular novella came out of his own confinement, imprisonment for several years. Though he didn't write it during confinement, but there is a lot of his experience in the isolated prison, where he could think about these things, and he came out of the book. Came out of the book. So isolation can even forced isolation. There have been instances of creativity, but it's a creativity that can be a bit of a challenge. It's not it's not like voluntary isolation, which creates a kind of happy creative inner self in the mind of the artist.
Okay. Professor Shivaprakash, that he is mentioning that, but people, writers do not exist in thin air. They all exist within the framework of a particular given society or a nation or community. That existence itself involves many other things, especially the economic patterns of the given community. So these, unless somebody gets supported for by university or some kind of institution for a lengthy period of time, that itself is good enough reason to kill a person. We are seeing continuously what in social media. We are seeing that the numbers are increasing. That artists, writers, and singers, film artists, they are all saying again and again that they are going into depression. There are people, even including stand-up comedians, they are saying that they are undergoing treatment for depression.
Yes, the very point. Now, these when I look at these film stars and singers, etc., doing concerts and doing programs on Zoom, etc., I can see that they're desperately trying to escape loneliness, and they don't know how to handle loneliness. A creative writer worth his salt is somebody who has been able to self-isolate, isolate himself or herself, even without this period of pandemic. Otherwise, one can't write. I said there is this dialectical relationship between conviviality and isolation. And for example, how does one account for the fact that some of the most intense love poems are written during the period of isolation? And our Bhakti poets, for example, were able to write the greatest poetry when they were in isolation. When they're in the world, they were feeling lost and disconnected. And when they withdrew into themselves, they felt connected. This holds true for all the spiritual poets. So, cultivating loneliness is an art which only some people, great yogis and great artists, succeed in achieving. Now, the situation is that this pandemic has pushed people into isolation when they are least prepared for it. And I suspect that from now on, if it lasts much longer, there'll be more and more cases of depression and all kinds of psychological violence happening. So one has to learn how to deal with the loneliness. That's why some people are talking about yoga, meditation, and contemplation. Not everybody needs to become a student of yoga, but learn from great artists how they weathered the period of loneliness, and they were able to be creative. We have many examples. For example, Shakespeare wrote his King Lear when there was a plague in England and the theatres were closed down. He wrote some of his best sonnets during this period. But all these periods were for a few months, a year or two, not longer. But if it stretches longer than that, what happens, we don't know. But I think we should learn to handle loneliness, how to handle loneliness. Otherwise, I think we'll succumb more and more to the attacks of depression and despondency and so on.
Okay. So, Professor Sumanyu Satpathy, that's a very interesting point. Come to think of it, that the creative writers by themselves have, either they are projected or societally they have been seen as people who are ultra emotional, or who are very frail. That is why many communities across the world, they feel that the artists are the ones who are weak, and therefore they have to be supported. So that is the reason why we see that artists. This is one point of view. What I'm saying is one point of view. That the artists and creative writers are the ones who always crave for some kind of a company. They cannot take isolation. Whereas on the other hand, as Shivaprakash is telling, it's a kind of a dialectical relationship. So the writer or a creative artist have to voluntarily isolate. How do we reconcile between these two? Or for that matter, do you agree that there is a merit in the first argument?
The merit in the first argument, that is?
Yeah, there is a creative people are more ultra emotional and they do not have inner strength.
I think all creative artists need to be a part of a larger. They have to be in a symbiotic relationship with the world outside, whether it is nature, human society, or companionship, one-to-one companionship. That's certainly a precondition for creativity. Otherwise, where will they get the material from? The emotion, the thought, the ideas, everything. At the same time, the actual act of composition, whether it is a creative writer or a painter, a sculptor, a scientist, historian, they have to get away and sit down and think, reflect on their experiences. Then only it will be possible for them to create something new. The actual act of creation cannot happen when one is in a crowd. The thinking can go on, but there are some very cliched examples. I don't want to cite them, but the moment of composition itself or the moment of creation itself can happen in isolation. At the same time, prolonged isolation doesn't help an artist or a creative mind to create anything new unless it is it's created out of memory, emotions recollected in tranquility, as Wordsworth would have put it. But it's more important that the artist is part of the society. Otherwise, it's not possible to create anything. But on a lighter note, I would like to say something. An artist cannot write without a reader or a viewer. So what has happened over the last few decades, life has become so busy for everyone. At the same time, the writer or the creative artist is able to create. But there are hardly any recipients of his or her ideas, very few readers. Now, one of the publishers told me that over the last 2 months, his books are selling very well because people are confined. They want to read, keep themselves engaged. The point that was being discussed a little earlier is how to cope with isolation. Yoga, meditation, of course, those are ways out. But I think books have been a great help. Those who have the habit of reading or partaking of, created world, universe through books and through the media, they have been able to keep themselves engaged. So, isolation is something that has helped the artist in an indirect sort of way, because now there is an audience. Over the last 2 months or 3 months, more and more people are able to read the work that is being created. So no artist can live in isolation, in the sense that his or her works need to be read, to be received, and to be received well. The other point that I want to say is, we have been talking about mostly Western traditions. Of course, Shivaprakash did mention the Bhakti poets, but the Indian tradition, somehow we have had the image of a Valmiki or a Vyasa, or even in Odia, Sarala Dasa, the great writers of epics, as rishis, people who have isolated themselves, and they have been able to create huge amount of huge body of writing. Of course, writing not in the sense in which we use it, but that is the image of a creative artist or writer as being isolated from the society and writing. I think that played such an important role that in the late 19th, early 20th century, two very well-known Odia writers, Radhanath Rai and Fakir Mohan, their works were prefaced by pictures of these two in a prayerful position, as if they are meditating, so that the readers get the impression that these people are also in the long tradition of Valmiki, Sharala Rasa, and so on and so forth. Whereas these two people were men of the world, both Radhanath Rai and Fakir Mohan, as all of us know, or those of us who know a little bit about their lives, they lived their life to the hilt. Whereas they wanted to create, through these images, that the image of a rishi or somebody who is away from the quotidian world. So somehow that stereotype of an artist as being isolated has gained ground. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of prototype or kind of a categorization is wrong. But Professor Shivaprakash, that that writing itself, creative writing itself, or a kind of a painting or sculptors, who involve themselves, that it involves prolonged periods of concentration and strength. That being the case, why would they require an additional help like a yoga or something?
Well, a mind which is not trained spiritually will get tired of doing the same thing again and again. So there is a limit to the extent to which one can keep on doing the same thing. How to be without doing anything, doing nothing, letting go of everything. That's what we learn from yoga and spirituality. This we don't learn from books. Book reading is a habit. And even the worst bookworm, if he keeps reading for 24 or 48 hours a day, he'll get bored. He wants to go out and have a drink or have a chat with his girlfriend or something. One can't keep on doing the same thing. But yoga and spirituality are important because they train you how to be without doing anything. The art of idleness, as Chinese writer Lin Yutong called it. This is one thing. And I think if during this period, this kind of training is very important. And before we wind up, I'd like to mention another thing which has made writing accessible across distances, even during periods of such periods of isolation. For example, the digital world, the virtual reality, has made it possible for us to share our works across distances, across continents. And that has been a great help in overcoming this feeling of isolation during this period for me. Because when I write a poem, I immediately put it on social media, and then somebody looks at it and translates it, and it travels. For example, a poem I wrote, some of the poems I wrote in the recent past, I put it on the Facebook, so my the readers from Latin America, they liked it and they translated it. Somebody translated it into Spanish, and it was circulated among Hispanic Latin American countries. Somebody translated in Portuguese, it was circulated in Brazil. So this digital reality has been a great help in overcoming the angst of this isolation during this pandemic period.
Yeah, Professor Sumanyu Satpathy.
Yeah, see what Shivaprakash said is very correct. But as long as the work that is being produced is in line with the creative genius of the author, the reception is very good. At the same time, many of us are forced to read what we call COVID literature. We have group mails, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry is writing poems about the pandemic, about the problem of the migrant laborer, and so on and so forth. Many of these writers are not good enough. Number one. Number two, even if they are good enough, because they are forced to write, or if they are as if they are expected to write along certain lines. So they end up writing poetry, which really doesn't look like poetry. You will recall that there's a lot of literature created during the emergency. People were isolated, not wholly like this pandemic, but many of us were isolated, and there was a lot of what is known as emergency literature. John Oliver Perry edited a volume of emergency poetry. Who reads them? I mean, 90% of that poetry is trash. You know, it's ephemeral. Maybe it excited us then, but it doesn't mean anything to us now. So creative writers have to be very careful in choosing their subject, and I don't know how much of this COVID literature will survive maybe 10-20 years down the line, but genuine writers, genuine creative artists, they would be able to create, and they are creating, like Shivaprakash mentioned, ideas which have traveled across the globe, and his poems, his lines have been well appreciated. But how many Shivaprakashes are there, in the virtual world? It doesn't help really, because the writer has a lot of time. He or she writes a lot of stuff, and sometimes it's cloying. Anyway, that's my impression.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a very good point. That probably there is a difference between the pandemic literature 100 years ago and pandemic literature today. The pandemic literature came after the pandemic was over in 1922. That last previous pandemic, the real pandemic lasted 4 or 5 years, 4 years. And this time, because of the digital, on the one hand, it helps to artists and writers who share their work instantly with the rest of the world, but also it also may lead to kind of materials that you are referring to, Professor Sumanyu, Satpathy, that requires some kind of editorial supervision. Not all artists, writers are on the same level. So that is missing from the previous, that's a probably crucial difference. Anyway, so from today's discussion, that only if I have to sum up, there is a dialectical relationship between conviviality and isolation, as Professor Shivaprakash put it. And the artists require to, they exist in the world, but also require voluntary isolation to produce some of the best creative works, their own works. So thank you, Professor Shivaprakash. Thank you, Professor Sumanyu Satpathy, for participating in this discussion. It has been wonderful to discuss with both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, the viewers around the world, please do keep watching Sahitya Akademi's programs in all 24 languages. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.